1 Samuel 25 is the one that's going to involve Nabal and Abigail. And those are going to be our three main characters. Nabal, his wife Abigail, couldn't be different in their character. And then David. And then on each side of that, there are servants. Servants that belong to David and servants that belong to Nabal and Abigail. And all of that's going to interact together. And we're going to learn a lot of things as we do this. Remember that Nabal is involved with sheep and goats. And if you look in verse 2, you find out he's a very wealthy man. And it lists, about 3,000 there, 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. And he was very rich, according to verse 2. It's sheep shearing time. This is a time when there's a lot of celebration, a lot of plenty. And this is an easy time to give to David's request. He has about 600 men with him out in the wilderness area. In verse 1 of this chapter, we find out Samuel has died. David's on the run. Saul's after him. And David's hiding out. 600 men with him. That'd be a hard crew to feed every day. And so he comes at sheep shearing time when there's just plenty to be had. And Nabal's very rich. And David and his men have sort of been watching out for Nabal's shepherds and their flocks, making sure that nobody hassles them, nobody is stealing from them, nobody is threatening them. And they watch out over them. But David's men, they don't take anything from them. They don't steal anything. They don't threaten his men. David has really earned something by safeguarding Nabal's herds and flocks and men all year long. And now he comes at sheep shearing time and he's asking for some help to give some supplies to David and his men. And he's treated rather poorly when all of that happens. That's where we're at. So you have a description in verse 3 of Abigail and her husband Nabal. Abigail is intelligent. She's beautiful. And Nabal is harsh and he's evil. You wonder how they paired up with each other. And you wonder in that day and age if there was some arrangement of a marriage. And that's what happened there, because they don't fit together very well. So David comes and sends men rather, and that's how he comes through his men, 10 of them. And he's asking for some help. And Nabal is mean-spirited and ugly and slanders David and refuses to help. And David's men go back and tell David what happened, and it's not going to go well. David is going to answer that. Verses 9 through 11. When David's young men came, they spoke to Nabal according to all these words in David's name. Then they waited. Nabal answered David's servants and said, "Who's David? Who's the son of Jesse? There are many servants today who are each breaking away from their master. Shall I then take my bread, my water, my meat that I've slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men whose origin I do not know?" So he denies David. He denies David's worth. He denies David's anointing of God. And who knows, maybe Nabal heard about the priests of Nob. We studied about them in earlier chapters where the priests of Nob helped David. And Saul comes later because they helped David, and he slaughters the whole city. Kills all the priests, like 85 of them. Well, maybe Nabal's heard about that. That doesn't come into play in this text that we know of, but it's possible. And the thing that's really coming out is Nabal's character. King James says he's churlish. He's just a harsh, mean-spirited, selfish sort of man. And so he declines to help David in the most rude way that he could do. And so David's going to respond to that in verses 12 and 13. So David's young men retraced their way and went back. And they came and told him according to all these words. David said to his men, "Each of you gird on his sword." So each man girded on his sword. And David also girded on his sword. And about 400 men went up behind David, while 200 stayed with the baggage. So David's purpose in this is revealed later. He's not just going with 400 soldiers to take what he wants. His plan is revealed later. If you look all the way down to verse 34, nevertheless, as the Lord God of Israel lives, who has restrained me from harming you, unless you had come quickly to meet me, surely there would not have been left to Nabal until the morning light as much as one male. He was going to kill off his family line. There would not be a man, boy, child left to carry on the family name. He was going to wipe them all out. And Nabal's name would be removed from the face of the earth. So that's what he was coming for. In the meantime, servants come to Abigail, and they tell her this is what happened. David sent his men. This has been the behavior of his men toward us. David's a good man. His men have been good to us. And this is the way your husband answered them. And so they come and tell Abigail the whole thing. It's interesting that the servants don't go to Nabal, their master. They don't go to him. They go to his wife. And it's interesting they would do that. And they can figure out what's about to happen. And they're going to get caught up in it with everybody else. Now we go down to verses 14 through 17, please. But one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, saying, behold, David sent messengers from the wilderness to greet our master. And he scorned them. That word scorn, that's an interesting word. That comes up in different places in the Bible, and I'll talk about that momentarily. He scorned them. Yet the men were very good to us. We were not insulted, nor did we miss anything as long as we went about with them while we were in the fields. They were a wall to us, both by night and by day, all the time we were with them tending the sheep. Now, therefore, no one consider what you should do, for evil is plotted against our master and against all his household, and he's such a worthless man that no one can speak to him. They know their master. They know what he's like. And so they go to his wife Abigail, their mistress, instead. So there are some things that are going to stand out to us in this section. Servants come to Abigail, tell her what's going on. What's she going to do? What's Abigail's response? How's she going to handle it? You've read ahead. What'd she do? She what? She gathers up gifts and things, and she's going to go to David, and she's going to appease his anger. She's going to give him supplies. And what else does she do when she comes to David? Remember, she is beautiful inside and out. Her inner character, her outward appearance, her body language is saying something. The way she approaches David, the words that she uses, the idea of bowing before him, being humble in his presence. Listen to her words. One of the things that we can learn from this section of text is how to appease an insulted brother or sister in Christ, as well as other people. How do you approach and diffuse a hostile situation? What do you do when there's trouble? And look at Abigail. She is smart, and she knows how to approach this. Her words are of a certain kind. Her tone, everything she does has a purpose. And this bomb is diffused, and lives are spared, and she becomes a hero in this situation. We learn something from her about this. So think about applying this when there's some hostile thing going on in your world, in your life. It could be at your house. It could be at the workplace. It could be in the congregation where you attend. And there's trouble. And it's really hostile. It's really hot-tempered. People aren't thinking clearly. They're going on emotion, and they have a course set in mind about what's going to happen. What can you do? This wasn't really about Abigail. But she stepped into it. And I want you to learn with me from her about all of this. So here are the actions of the servants. Who do they go to? Did Abigail do something behind her husband's back? Yeah, she did. Was her intent to hide it from him? Did she intend to hide it from him? There's a yes and a no here. She did it first, and she told him as soon as she could. And I preface that by saying he'd been drinking a lot. Have you ever tried to talk to somebody who's been drinking a lot? That's not the time to have a reasonable conversation with anybody. You don't approach anything during that period of time. If you've ever tried to do that, if you know what that world's like, if you know what people are like when they've been drinking, their mind and their emotion is not where it ought to be. And you don't get much through. As a matter of fact, after they sober up, they probably don't remember much of what you said. And sometimes that unlocks greater hostility when someone's been drinking. And that's Nabal. She doesn't tell him while he's feasting. She doesn't tell him while he's drinking. But after he sobers up, she immediately goes to tell him. Did she intend to hide something from her husband? Yes and no. She did something behind his back, but not to remain behind his back. She did something for him, not against him. And then she told him as soon as it was reasonable to do that. She did not intend to hide it from him forever. And she actually did good for him when he was actually working harm toward her. Think about the outcome that was coming. So we have that. Then you have the violent purpose of David. How did David respond to King Saul when Saul was after him and David had opportunity to kill his enemy, King Saul? How did David respond to that? Did he do it? He had mercy on Saul. Saul was the Lord's anointed. This is a very different response to Nabal, isn't it? David lets his emotions get the better of him. Part of Abigail's reasoning to David here is the same kind of reasoning David would have applied to King Saul. And she lets David know this is not something just to apply to King Saul. This is something to apply to all men. And she does that in the most gentle, intelligent way. We'll see that as this text begins to unfold. So the servants know the situation. They can see the eventual outcome. They know the character of Nabal. They go to Abigail. And what word do they use to describe their master Nabal? The servants. What do they call him? Scoundrel, verse 17. My text says worthless. Some may say scoundrel. Anybody have a different word for Nabal? Wicked, scoundrel, worthless. Anything else? Son of Belial. That's not God. That's the opposite of God. He's just worthless as a person and couldn't care less about other people. And so they know who he is, and they use that word to talk about him. Now, I mentioned I was going to tell you a little bit more about that word scorned. Back in verse 14, David came with messengers from the wilderness to greet our master. He scorned them. I want you to look at 1 Samuel 15. 1 Samuel 15. We're going back a ways. 1 Samuel 15, verse 19. 1 Samuel 15, verse 19. Make sure that's the right one. Yep. Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord, but rushed upon the spoil and did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. This is about Amalek. This is about King Saul's disobedience of God and how they were coveting the spoils of the enemy. And rather than destroy them the way the Lord said to do, they gathered them up. They didn't want to destroy the best of the stuff. And so they are accused of rushing upon the spoil. That word rushed is the same term that we have the word scorned from. He scorned David. He rushed upon him. It's a violent word. It could be translated as shout, attack. It could be dart greedily, scoop in on. This is the kind of reaction that Nabal had on David when he scorned him. This greedy, rushing, sort of emotional outburst without thinking through it, doing what you want to without considering the outcome. As they rushed upon the spoil they didn't have the right to have, should have been destroyed by the word of the Lord. That's Nabal's emotional gut reaction against David, swooping in, rushing in on him in a violent sort of way. And that's what he does to David. He scorned his messengers. All right? Nabal's personality, the servants decide, is unapproachable. He's an unapproachable man. What made him unapproachable? Tell me some things that, if you had to deal with Nabal, what would make him unapproachable? Why wouldn't you want to talk to him? He's what? Self-centered? Greedy? Drinker? All right, you have this ugly, mean-spirited, only thinks about himself, can only see things from his own viewpoint, doesn't care anything about other people or any kind of impact it's going to have on them. He's not generous of spirit. He's not benevolent of heart. He doesn't care if you starve to death. All he cares about is himself. He's greedy. He has plenty. He has more than he could ever use in life. He's very rich, and he doesn't care about anybody. This is like Lazarus and the rich man. Lazarus was the beggar who was out there outside the house of the rich man, and he just wanted a crumb to fall from the table. He didn't have any hope in life whatsoever. And here's this rich man, and he doesn't even give him a crumb from the table. Couldn't care less about him. That's Nabal. He's not the kind of man you can reason with. So they know that. They know he's unapproachable. By the way, sometimes we label people unapproachable. We need to be very careful about doing that because we're saying something about their character. Sometimes when we view somebody as unapproachable, do you know what makes them unapproachable? Our own fear of approaching them. It's us. Sometimes we don't want to approach somebody because we're so uncomfortable having any kind of confrontation, conversation about anything difficult. Something difficult needs to be talked about, and we'll go and we'll talk to everybody else except that person because we label them unapproachable, and sometimes that's not very fair. If they're like Nabal, all right, they're unapproachable. But when we say we can't approach somebody, we're saying they're somewhat like Nabal. So we need to be very careful about saying that and recognize sometimes it's our own fear of doing something hard. And so here is Abigail. She's going to come to the rescue. Verses 18 through 20. Abigail hurried, took 200 loaves of bread, 2 jugs of wine, 5 sheep already prepared, and 5 measures of roasted grain, and 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs, and loaded them on donkeys. She said to her young men, "Go on before me. Behold, I'm coming after you." But she did not tell her husband Nabal. It came about as she was riding on her donkey and coming down by the hidden part of the mountain. Now you can picture this scene. She is coming down by the hidden part of the mountain. Behold, David and his men were coming down toward her. So you have two hills, and they're both coming down, and they're meeting in the valley. And so here they come, and now they can see each other, and there's going to be a meeting. And remember, she's intelligent. And if you ask the question, did she do the right thing? How would your estimation of that be? Did Abigail do the right thing? Was she submissive to her husband? She saved his life. Was she submissive to her husband? She did the right thing. She did not consult her husband. She knew her husband's decision in the matter. She did something contrary to that. I wouldn't necessarily call that submission to her husband, but she did the right thing. There are categories in the New Testament, roles of submission. A wife should be submissive to her husband. Children should be submissive to their parents. Servants should be submissive to their masters. Congregations should be submissive to their elders. You have roles of submission in the Bible. Does it ever give you permission to do the wrong thing? It does not. We need to be very, very, very careful when we think about that. We are to be submissive as much as is possible, but if there's ever a choice between God and right and doing something wrong and evil, we ought not to be submissive to the wrong. We should be submissive in all those areas where we ought to be. If a parent teaches a child to shoplift, hopefully a child will grow to an age of accountability where they realize they can't do that. That's wrong. And not be submissive to their parents just for the sake of being submissive. A husband and wife are to work together in a marriage. But sometimes one wants wrong and one wants right. One should not be submissive to the error to get along in the relationship. Case in point, Adam and Eve, Garden of Eden. One took forbidden fruit and the other one went along with it. There are cases when you have a master and a servant. And even though there's a submissive relationship that the Bible teaches there, when it comes to opposing God, one ought to do the right thing. Did Abigail do the right thing? She did the right thing. Was she submissive to her husband? She knew he was making a different decision, and she did the opposite. But she did good for her husband. She did good for him. And that's what it is today whenever we have to do the right thing. Remember that we are being a beacon of hope and light in a wrong situation. Sometimes we need to do what's right when it comes to a choice of being submissive in a normal situation where submission is taught. But it's the right thing, and it's a beacon of light and hope to not be submissive in that point, but do what's right in the eyes of God. God always comes first in every relationship. Sometimes a boy and a girl will start dating each other. One might be a Christian and one's not. Who's going to win that? Who's going to do the right thing? does God come first? Husbands and wives the same way. And so Abigail is not submissive to her husband in the fullest sense of that idea, but she does good for him. She wants to benefit him. She does what's right. She does what's godly. And she's true to her character in that way. So think about how all of that dynamic plays out. But please be very careful when it comes to congregational life, family life, employment situations, other things that we're doing. Be very careful when you say, well, I'm not going to be submissive here. I'm going to do this instead. Be sure you know why you're doing that and that God is the one governing that situation. He's in control of it. And don't make it a place of rejecting your submissive role because you have a preference or an opinion. This was a critical issue. This is life and death. And she was doing good for everybody involved, including her husband. But she went contrary to his desire at that point because it was the right thing to do. So be careful how you apply that, but think about it. And if you find yourself in a situation where you are submitting to error that is opposed to God's will, to hang on to some relationship or even a paycheck, rethink that. Be ready to pay the price for doing what is right in the eyes of God. And make sure that He is the one who is Lord of your life in difficult situations. You might have some comments or thoughts there. I hope I didn't muddy that up too much. All right. Abigail meets David. Each are coming down the hillside toward each other, verse 20. Verse 21 and 22. Now David had said, surely in vain I've guarded all that this man has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him. He's returned me evil for good. May God do so to the enemies of David and more also, if by morning I leave as much as one male of any who belong to him. So that's David's attitude in this. This is where he's going. And now we come into this diplomacy and wisdom of Abigail. She's going to diffuse this situation. And we come down to verses 23 through about 25. When Abigail saw David, she hurried. Look at her body language here. She sees David, she hurried, she dismounted from her donkey, fell on her face before David, bowed herself to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, on me alone, my Lord, be the blame. And please let your maidservant speak to you, and listen to the words of your maidservant. Please do not let my Lord pay attention to this worthless man, Nabal. For as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your maidservant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent. And when she says Nabal is his name, and folly is with him, as his name is, so is he. What she's doing, there's a play on words there. The name Nabal and the word for folly are related Hebrew terms. Very similar. They have a very similar sound to them and a very similar meaning. So Nabal is his name, folly is his game, and she knows that, and she admits it readily. So this is how she's going to approach David: respectful, submissive, humble. First words out of his mouth, or out of her mouth, the first words out of her mouth are humble. She is taking the blame. I'm sorry, my fault, I didn't see your young men coming. This would have been handled very differently. And my husband is one way, but I'm very different. And she turns the attention from her husband to herself. In her humility, in her respect, in her honor of David, in her apology, with the gifts that she's bringing, she's turning the direction of this, and she petitions two things. One is to speak. What's the other one? It's different than speaking. It's related. Would you give me the opportunity to speak, and would you hear me? Would you listen? Would you hear what I have to say? It's one thing, and you've run into this situation where you're up against somebody and you are at odds with each other, and you're speaking and they're hearing your words, but their arms are folded, their face is stern, they're angry, and they're not listening. It's one thing to have your voice coming out of your mouth. It's another thing to have the words entering the mind and the heart of the individual you're talking to. So she petitions not only to be able to speak, but if she could actually have the ears, the heart, the mind of David, and he would listen to her. So she's asking for those two things. And then in verse 25, she turns that attention from her husband to herself. And when she says, "This is my husband, but I, your maidservant," she's implying, but I'm different. He's this way, and I'm very different. Not everybody connected to Nabal is like him. Not everybody deserves to die. And so that's what she's pleading with David about. Now, she admits the nature of her husband. Would it have diffused this bomb if she would have approached David and started defending Nabal? If she would have started defending her husband and making excuses for his behavior and his attitude, would that have diffused this situation or angered David more? When wrong has been committed and you try to defend it, it escalates the situation. There's no defense. And it's upsetting to hear that sort of thing. But if you hear an admission of error, of guilt, all right, now I'm being heard. Now you're understanding. Now you're getting it. So she goes on first admitting the nature of her husband, and she tells David, yeah, he's a man of folly, just like his name. And then she goes on, verse 26 through 31. Now therefore, my Lord, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, since the Lord has restrained you from shedding blood and from avenging yourself by your own hand, now then let your enemies and those who seek evil against my Lord be as Nabal. Now let this gift which your maidservant has brought to my Lord be given to the young men who accompany my Lord. Please forgive the transgression of your maidservant, for the Lord will certainly make for my Lord an enduring house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, and evil will not be found in you all your days. Should anyone rise up to pursue you and to seek your life, then the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living with the Lord your God. By the way, I'll just pause there in verse 29 before I read the rest of that. Every once in a while in these studies, whether it's 1 Samuel or some other book of the Bible, going through studies, I run across things and I sort of log them into my memory as a sermon title for later. And this is one of those. Sometimes people ask me, well, where do you get sermon ideas from? All right, look at that phrase in verse 29. This is the New American Standard Update. Bound in the bundle of the Lord. That's a sermon title. Are you bound in the bundle of the Lord? That'll make a great sermon someday. It won't be anytime soon because we're studying through it right now. So it wouldn't do any good, but that's a great lesson title and a great biblical theme, being bound up in the bundle of the Lord. And then she says, but the lives of your enemies he will sling out as from the hollow of a sling. And when the Lord does for my Lord according to all good that he's spoken concerning you and appoints you ruler over Israel, this will not cause grief or a troubled heart to my Lord, both by having shed blood without cause and by my Lord having avenged himself. When the Lord deals well with my Lord, then remember your maidservant. So here is her reasoning. Here's her dialogue. She has her body language as she dismounts, bows before David, very humble words, taking the blame, turning attention from her husband to herself, making the apology, letting David know, I'm not like my husband is. Not everybody connected to him is like him. Here's everything you've asked for and more. And she asked for forgiveness. And she's asking David to consider this moment. Did you know that the moment can determine the future? Are you aware of that? In hindsight, we all are. You and I will think back to a moment in our life when we reacted, we responded a certain way. And it might have been on emotion, it might have been a gut instinct, it might have been a desire of that moment. And the moment determined the future. The moment sowed a seed, and later came the harvest. Life turned a certain direction, it turned a certain way. And she's reminding David, this moment is going to play out in your future. And she begins to talk to him about God. Of all people, Abigail's talking to David about God. Here is God's promise to you. God's promised you the throne. God's going to defend you. You've not shed innocent blood before. You've not avenged yourself before. And so now, when all these things take place, you can have a clean conscience before God when He performs all the promises He's given to you, when He sets you on the throne, and to know that you behave the way a king ought to behave, and one who trusts in God. This moment is going to determine your conscience in the future. When this chapter of life is over and the new one opens up and you're on that throne, this is going to determine your conscience. And she reasons with him this way and brings God into the discussion, and not just as a ploy. She's not just manipulating him through God. She's speaking sincerely. This is her character. This is her nature. And she begins to reason with him about godliness. And the Lord is the one who will avenge him. By the way, this again is Romans chapter 12 being played out. Romans 12, the end of that chapter, talks to us about not avenging ourselves, leaving room for the vengeance of God. Return good for evil, blessing for cursing. Let vengeance belong to God. And she's telling him, God's going to take care of you that way. He's promised you that. And if you do this now, it's going to affect your relationship with God later. And so she reasons with him, and if you read Romans 12, the end of that chapter in particular, you see this as an illustration of that. And the same reason that David had not avenged himself against King Saul is the reason he ought not to avenge himself against Nabal. Nabal is not threatening his life. This is not like a foreign army coming against him. This is a personal insult that he's given to David. And David needs to respond to this differently than he's about to, and she calls him to think about all of those things and to consider. We learn some things in this text about handling trouble, especially between brethren, because it comes up. It comes up in the church. It comes up in the local congregation. And there's something to be said about our body language. What's your facial expression? What are you saying with your arms, with the way you're standing? With the tone of voice that you're using? Are you willing to accept blame? Are you having a humble approach? Are you really seeking to bring it together or to escalate it? Are you being polite and asking for an opportunity to be heard and listened to? Do you admit when wrong has been done? Can you just point out the wrong in the other person and not see it in yourself? All of these things were being taught. Turning the attention to the relationship with God. How do you handle trouble between brethren? Is God the centerpiece of that confrontation? Is He in the middle of that conversation? Is it really about God? Or is it about me? Or is it about you? Something else? Or is God in the center of that? Are we seeking the good of everybody involved? Abigail wanted good for her husband, for the servants of David, for the servants of Nabal. She wanted good for everybody, including David and herself. This is not just manipulating somebody for personal advantage. This is seeking good for everybody involved. In 2 Corinthians 5:11, when we persuade men in that text, it is about the gospel message. It is the truth about God. And it is to benefit them, us, and everybody else involved. We persuade in a godly way for a godly purpose, not for personal advantage. Now, we'll pick up in verse 32 next week when we get together. We'll probably finish out this handout then. I appreciate your attention in class, and we are dismissed.